The late afternoon sun dipped low behind the towering skyscrapers of Washington, D.C., casting a fiery golden glow over the city. The streets, usually bustling with life, grew quieter as the day's light began to fade. The Toac River glistened with the last of the sun's rays, and the city's grandeur seemed to take on a more ominous tone. Outside the federal courthouse, the hurried footsteps of reporters, lawyers, and government officials echoed down the street as they headed toward their fates within. Today wasn't just any ordinary day in Washington. This day would forever be etched into America's political history. A showdown was about to unfold in the grand courthouse, not between lawyers and witnesses, but between ideologies, a battle for the very soul of the nation. The case at hand was a lawsuit filed by a human rights organization accusing the Trump administration's hardline immigration policies of violating basic human rights and causing irreparable harm to immigrant communities. The tension inside the courtroom was palpable. The air felt thick with anticipation as the walls themselves seemed to brace for the clash of these opposing ideals. Rows of seats filled with onlookers, journalists, and political operatives, all waiting for what would become a historic trial. On one side sat Tom Homan, the former head of ICE, a staunch defender of the Trump administration's tough stance on immigration. His unyielding gaze swept across the room as he sat rigid in his chair, a man with no regrets about his stance. He believed the policies he defended were not only necessary, but vital for the safety of the nation, and no amount of protest would sway him from that conviction. Across the room, sitting in the gallery, was Joy Behar, a fierce critic of the administration and a champion for progressive policies. She wasn't here by accident. She was the voice of resistance, representing the marginalized, the voiceless. Behar wasn't just a talk show host. She had spent years fighting for policies that could unite the country rather than deepen its divisions. Today, she was prepared to challenge Homan, armed with nothing but her words and her unwavering beliefs. As the judge called the room to order, the tension was nearly unbearable. Silence swept over the courtroom like a heavy cloak. This was no longer just a legal proceeding. It was a battle for the country's future. Homan spoke first, his voice low and steady. "We cannot protect this country if we do not protect our borders," he declared, his words clipped with authority. "Our policies are necessary. Without them, we are vulnerable to threats both foreign and domestic. We cannot afford to let anyone bypass the system. The security of the American people must come first." Behar, undeterred, rose to speak. Her voice, sharp and filled with conviction, rang out. "What you call border security is nothing more than a fortress of oppression. These policies don't just separate families, they discriminate. They strip away human dignity from those who seek nothing more than a chance at a better life. This is not justice. This is an assault on everything America stands for." She paced slightly, her words growing more impassioned as she continued. "You claim these policies are about safety, but all they've done is create fear. Immigrant families are torn apart. Children are locked in cages. These are not the actions of a country that claims to welcome the tired and the poor. This is a nation turning its back on those in need." Behar's gaze never wavered from Homan. "What you call law and order, I call cruelty. You've built a system that punishes the most vulnerable in our society, and you've disguised it as protection for the American people. But the truth is, these policies are a betrayal of the very principles America was founded upon." Homan stood unflinching, his eyes locked on Behar, and his voice grew more resolute. "What do you call cruelty, I call necessary action," he said firmly. These policies are about protecting American citizens. We cannot afford to allow illegal immigration to run unchecked. This is not about race, it's about survival. If we don't enforce our borders, if we don't have control over who enters our country, we are putting everyone at risk. The tension in the room deepened as Behar fired back. You talk about survival, but what about the survival of the very values this country was founded on? What about the families you're destroying, the lives you're wrecking with your policies? She took a step forward, her voice rising with emotion. This isn't about borders. This is about humanity. You stand there defending a system that divides, families that criminalizes people for seeking refuge. You stand there defending a system that does the opposite of what America should stand for. Homan was unshaken. He crossed his arms, his posture rigid. These policies exist because they're needed, he countered. Without them, we risk losing our national identity, our security. We cannot afford to be naive. You want to talk about human rights? What about the rights of American citizens? Those who have followed the law, paid taxes, and worked hard to build their lives? What about them? The courtroom fell silent as Behar, her voice steady and unyielding, responded. What about the children taken from their parents? What about the families who've been torn apart by your policies? These are human beings, not criminals. You've reduced them to statistics, to faceless figures, but they are people, and we cannot forget that. Homan shifted slightly, his expression hardening. You can call it injustice all you want, but the fact remains, immigration is about security. This country cannot survive if we let anyone enter without following the proper channels. Behar was not about to back down. Her voice grew stronger with each word. You talk about security, but what about the security of the people you're hurting? You're defending a system that punishes the powerless, that locks out those who need help the most. This is not the America we're supposed to be. As Homan stood silent, his jaw clenched, Behar pressed on. You call it law and order, but it's chaos. Chaos that destroys lives. Chaos that tears families apart. Homan's expression remained unreadable, but his voice was clear. You can call it chaos, but I call it necessary action. Without these policies, we risk everything. We risk losing our way of life, and that's something I refuse to allow. The air in the courtroom seemed to thicken as Behar, not missing a beat, pivoted the conversation to another level. Let's talk about the environment, she said, her gaze steady. People from countries ravaged by climate change are fleeing their homes, and yet you refuse to acknowledge the environmental crisis. You're closing the door on those who are running from the devastation your policies are contributing to. Homan stood motionless. He had heard arguments like this before, but now he had to respond. Look, Joy, I understand the gravity of climate change, he began, his voice calm but firm. But immigration policies are about securing our borders. They're not about addressing every global crisis. We cannot take in everyone, and we cannot afford to turn our country upside down just to accommodate everyone who wants to come here. Behar's eyes narrowed. You ignore the root of the problem, the very system that creates these crises. People are fleeing environmental destruction, and you're telling them they don't belong here. You're turning away those who need help most, and that's a betrayal of everything America stands for. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Both sides had delivered their arguments, but the debate about immigration, human rights, security, and survival was far from over. This was more than just a legal battle. It was a fight for the soul of a nation. These policies exist because they're needed, he countered. Without them, we risk losing our national identity, our security. We cannot afford to be naive. You want to talk about human rights? What about the rights of American citizens? Those who have followed the law, paid taxes, and worked hard to build their lives? What about them? The courtroom fell silent as Behar, her voice steady and unyielding, responded. What about the children taken from their parents? What about the families who've been torn apart by your policies? These are human beings, not criminals. You've reduced them to statistics, to faceless figures, but they are people, and we cannot forget that. Homan shifted slightly, his expression hardening. You can call it injustice all you want, but the fact remains, immigration is about security. This country cannot survive if we let anyone enter without following the proper channels. Behar was not about to back down. Her voice grew stronger. With each word, you talk about security, but what about the security of the people you're hurting? You're defending a system that punishes the powerless, that locks out those who need help the most. This is not the America we're supposed to be. As Homan stood silent, his jaw clenched, Behar pressed on. You call it law and order, but it's chaos. Chaos that destroys lives, chaos that tears families apart. Homan's expression remained unreadable, but his voice was clear. You can call it chaos, but I call it necessary action. Without these policies, we risk everything. We risk losing our way of life, and that's something I refuse to allow. The air in the courtroom seemed to thicken as Behar, not missing a beat, pivoted the conversation to another level. Let's talk about the environment, she said, her gaze steady. People from countries ravaged by climate change are fleeing their homes, and yet you refuse to acknowledge the environmental crisis. You're closing the door on those who are running from the devastation your policies are contributing to. Homan stood motionless. He had heard arguments like this before, but now he had to respond. Look, Joy, I understand the gravity of climate change, he began, his voice calm but firm. But immigration policies are about securing our borders. They're not about addressing every global crisis. We cannot take in everyone, and we cannot afford to turn our country upside down just to accommodate everyone who wants to come here. Behar's eyes narrowed. You ignore the root of the problem, the very system that creates these crises. People are fleeing environmental destruction, and you're telling them they don't belong here. You're turning away those who need help most. And that's a betrayal of everything America stands for. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Both sides had delivered their arguments, but the debate about immigration, human rights, security, and survival was far from over. This was more than just a legal battle. It was a fight for the soul of a nation. The United States has always been at the forefront of addressing climate change, but the solution is not to open our borders to every person fleeing environmental disasters without regard to the resources already strained here. The reality is that the US cannot solve the world's environmental problems at the expense of its own citizens. Tom Homan's tone grew sharper, his words deliberate. We have a responsibility to protect our own, to ensure the safety and well-being of the people who already live here, he declared, stepping forward. While I acknowledge the urgency of climate change, solving that problem doesn't mean we open the floodgates to unchecked immigration. Immigration policies are necessary, not just for national security, but for ensuring that our economy, infrastructure, and society remain intact while we deal with these global issues. His voice grew more intense as he continued. You're right about one thing. Climate change is a real threat. But we cannot ignore our national security in the process. We need to solve our domestic issues before we can save the planet. If we don't protect our own borders, we risk creating a crisis that will hurt everyone in the long run. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Homan's words echoed through the room. Joy Behar, no longer content with subtlety, leaned forward. Her sharp eyes locked onto Homan, and the time for restraint was over. Her voice rang out, slicing through the silence like a blade. "You sit there, Tom," Behar began, her tone hardening. "Talking about law and order, about protecting the rights of American citizens, but you've ignored the human cost of your policies. Your so-called protection doesn't just close borders, it closes hearts. You care more about protecting the legal than the human." Her words landed like a punch. She didn't shy away from making it personal, accusing him of caring more about the law than humanity. "What about the people who need protection the most?" she continued. "You call yourself a protector, but you're the one perpetuating the harm. You're letting the most vulnerable in society, the children, the families, fall through the cracks in the name of national security. That's not justice. That's cruelty." Behar stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "You're building walls, not just on our borders, but between us as a society. And for what? For a few pieces of paper? For the illusion of safety? How many lives are you willing to sacrifice to maintain that illusion?" Homan's expression hardened, his jaw tightened, but he remained unmoved. He had heard it all before. The weight of Behar's words hung in the air, and yet he refused to yield. "I don't apologize for wanting to protect this country," Homan shot back, his eyes locking onto Behar's. "The government's job is to serve and protect the American people, not people who are coming here illegally, disregarding the very laws that keep this country running. That's what the law is for, to ensure fairness and maintain order. We can't afford to waste resources on people who break the law before even stepping foot in this country." His voice rose, controlled but firm. "This isn't about what's convenient or what sounds good. This is about protecting citizens who follow the rules, citizens who deserve the safety and security our laws provide. There's no room for compromise when it comes to protecting our country from those who would take advantage of it." The room fell silent, each person feeling the weight of his words. Homan had drawn his line in the sand, refusing to back down. But Behar was far from finished. She took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving him, and leaned in again. "Tell me, Tom," Behar said, her voice slicing through the tension, "how can you call it justice when the most vulnerable, the ones who need our help the most, are turned away with nothing but the cold metal of your border walls in their faces?" She paused for effect, letting her words sink in. "How can you call yourself a protector of this country when you're willing to let the weakest among us suffer?" Her final question hung in the air, a challenge, a demand for accountability. Behar had forced Homan into a corner, and she wasn't backing down. The debate had escalated. There was no turning back now. With no further words, Behar motioned to her legal team, who brought forward a projector. The lights dimmed, and the screen flickered to life. Behar's voice rang out with certainty. "Let's talk about reality," she said, pointing to the screen. "You can sit here all day and claim that your policies are about safety and law and order, but this is the real cost of your so-called solutions." The screen displayed a series of videos, violent clashes between law enforcement and immigrants at the border, families being torn apart, children crying as they were separated from their parents, and moments of tension between peaceful protesters and riot police. The images were raw and emotional, a stark portrayal of the consequences of the policies Homan had spent the entire trial defending. "These are not isolated incidents," Behar continued, her tone sharp as a blade. "This is the result of a system that dehumanizes those seeking refuge, a system built on policies that see people as threats instead of human beings. These are not criminals or illegal trespassers. These are families. These are children, fleeing violence and environmental disaster, and you're treating them like they're the enemy. She turned to face Homan directly. How do you explain this? How do you justify these images with your so-called secure borders? Homan remained stoic, though his jaw tightened. He knew this moment was coming, but he was ready. He stood, his voice calm yet unwavering, prepared to dismantle the accusation. First of all, let me make one thing clear, Homan began, his voice strong and his eyes locked onto Bahar's. These are individual incidents, isolated moments that do not represent the entire picture. Every policy has its flaws, but that does not mean the entire system should be condemned. These videos are heartbreaking, yes, but they are anomalies, moments where the system didn't work as it should. But to use them as a blanket condemnation of our immigration policy is irresponsible. He took a step forward, his tone growing more intense. What you're ignoring, Joy, is that we're facing a crisis. This isn't just about one child or one family. This is about national security. And when millions of people cross the border illegally, we are left with no choice but to act. We can't afford to be sentimental when it comes to protecting this country. Homan paused, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom. You can show me all the videos you want, but the truth is, we cannot let a small group of people take advantage of a crisis to undermine the safety and security of this nation. The room fell silent again as Homan's words hung in the air, heavy with their meaning. He had drawn the line. Bahar's emotional appeal had been met with hard-edged logic, and now there was no more room for negotiation. The debate had reached its zenith, and both sides had made their cases. Homan's final words were sharp, deliberate, and undeniable. We cannot allow a few individuals to exploit this situation and weaken the very foundation of our national security. If we do that, we risk losing everything. As the courtroom still echoed with the intensity of the final exchanges, it slowly began to quiet. The trial had ended, but the battle between Bahar's passionate defense of human rights and Homan's steadfast commitment to national security had left no clear victor. The public's reaction was swift. News outlets buzzed with coverage, some praising Bahar for her moral clarity, while others, particularly conservative outlets, defended Homan's position as pragmatic and necessary. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was divided, a small group of protesters holding signs with slogans like "Justice for Immigrants" and "Secure our borders." As the judges retired to deliberate, speculation ran rampant. The thoroughness of the arguments from both sides had left everyone wondering which case would prevail. Hours later, the judge rose to announce the outcome. There has been no consensus between the two sides, the judge stated gravely. Both have presented compelling arguments and both have held their ground firmly. It is clear that this issue, much like the policies it addresses, will require further discussion and resolution. The judge paused, looking around the room. We must give serious consideration to the long-term effects of these policies, not just on our laws, but on the very fabric of society itself. The immigration policies of this nation need to be thoroughly reassessed, keeping in mind both their human and societal costs. The gavel struck, signaling the end of the trial, but the debate was far from over. The public's reaction, the media coverage, and the policymakers' response would ensure that this issue remained at the forefront of national discourse. The future of America, shaped by the debate over security, compassion, and the American dream, remained an open question, one that could not be answered in a single trial or by a single verdict. The courtroom doors closed behind them, and Washington, D.C. stood in the quiet reflection of the day's events. The city, once bustling, now seemed to pause, as if it too was contemplating the gravity of the debate. As Behar and Homan walked in opposite directions, each deep in thought, the ripples of the debate continued to echo. The trial had ended, but the ideological battle was just beginning, and its consequences were yet to be fully realized.